Chapter 4. The Vote. The next 2 years seemed to drag by. Every day was filled with my lessons at the shape rate, my standard lessons with Branka, but fewer and fewer lessons with Trian. According to Trian, I'd learned almost all I could from him, so he began allowing me to train with Faran and Ogren. I also had multiple meetings with a large variety of people every day. From nobles to castells, I met with them all, answering questions, offering suggestions, and trying to ease fears or concerns. While the majority of Orzamar's citizens were excited for the establishment of the Surface Caste, there were still some holdouts. I also had daily reports coming, detailing new surface contracts, amounts of materials and goods that were brought in, how much gold was exchanging hands, and how much in taxes were being collected. At least once a month I would leave Orzamar to go see the progress of the businesses being set up along the mountainside, which the people had started calling Merida's steps. With every visit, there was more and more progress. Vendors would insist on giving examples of their goods, reports on how their shipments are doing, or offering me tours of their houses, businesses, because they were one and the same in these cases. Each time I visited, Father insisted I bring 100 Ejukan guards, and had the same ones on standby. Each time, they had their hands full of goods and samples by the time we left. Rika was doing wonderfully in her efforts. The dwarven smithing fuel factory she'd set up was easily the most productive business setup so far. She'd gained a fair number of contracts with human lumber providers and received trees almost daily. She used them to provide Orzamar with more of the clean-burning fuel than ever before, while still being able to sell half of what she made to dwarven smith families, or human merchants who paid top price for such a marvelous product. It became so popular that the product was named after Branka, and the secret to its production was limited to House Branka and Rika's business by decree of the Assembly. That edict had essentially given Rika a highly lucrative exclusive contract. Farron's training was coming along excellently. Now that I trained alongside him, sometimes I could see the gap in our skills. Trian likely made a mistake when he insisted on training me for as long as he did, instead of allowing Ogren to take over when he was brought in to train Farron. While he wasn't as physically strong as Ogren yet, Farron was nearly just as skilled. In a few more years, he would be a match for most of the warriors in the city. He'd decided on specializing in wielding the sword and shield so he could protect me better, while I opted for the greatsword. The staff Trian had given me was still tall enough that the blade hidden inside could serve as a greatsword, but that would be changing soon enough. I was still growing, after all. As far as my time in the Fade went, Purpose had helped me with learning new spells. I added Stone Fist, Frost Weapons, Rejuvenate, Cone of Cold, Heroic Aura, and Blizzard to my list of spells. With all the new spells I had access to, Trian insisted we tell Father and Mother. They could help figure out how best to reveal this to the rest of the world. They said they would think about it, but Mother said she had a good idea. What I didn't tell Trian was that I actively used Heroic Aura whenever I would go out into the city or visit the surface. Unlike in the game, there was no visual cue that the spell was active, but it did require a dedicated amount of my mana to maintain. I tested it with Trian, and it did serve to reduce the impact of incoming projectiles. But it also seemed to have a morale-boosting effect on those within a 30-yard radius around me. To say that I didn't have much downtime was an understatement. In fact, the most levity I had during those 2 years was with Kala, who seemed to have adopted me as a surrogated daughter once Rika had left for the Surface. So she made sure that, when I woke up, and as I was getting ready for bed, were times where I could relax and take a breather. She helped me prepare for the day and helped me unwind by allowing me to vent my frustrations. She also ensured that my meals were as stress-free as possible, though since most meals were also meetings, that wasn't always possible. Overall, she was a wonderful attendant and cherished friend. Trian also had mounting responsibilities and concerns and wasn't able to help me with as many lessons. We didn't spend as much time together as we used to, but I did see and speak with him every day. He had concerns about the Surface Caste, but as I showed him the reports, he couldn't argue with the results. Morale in the city seemed high and the revenue was excellent, and Trian could see how that would benefit the throne and the family. Regardless of what most believed about him, he wasn't emotionless. He didn't necessarily agree that someone should pay the price for crimes their ancestors from 10 generations ago committed. I made another new friend in those 2 years as well, Nerav Helmi. She was a few years older than I was, but we met when she was brought along by her brother Denik Helmi for one of our meetings. Denik was the Deshir representative of House Helmi and was a very forward-thinking dwarf, much to his mother's chagrin. Nerav and I would have little chats here and there, and she would sometimes come for dinner whenever I had a night where dinner wasn't another meeting. We got along very well, and I fostered the friendship because I knew that Trian would eventually have eyes for her. If the dwarven noble origin was a male, Nerav would be a love interest that couldn't happen. But if the dwarven noble origin was female, and I was, Nerav would become Trian's fiancé. So I get a good friend, and Trian gets a wonderful fiancé. It was a win-win for everyone. But the day was coming up, and those last few days were hectic with preparation. Meetings on top of meetings. Stacks of reports kept flowing in. It was everything we could do to keep all the information as up-to-date as possible. Not that it really mattered. There were more materials and more gold in Orzammar than there had been in generations, and that was just with the efforts of setting the businesses up. I couldn't imagine a single Deshir voting against the Surface Caste's official establishment, especially considering the social ramifications it would have. Riots would be the very least of the Deshir's worries should they vote the establishment proposal down. The day of my 7th birthday had come, and I was again gifted with a suit of armor, this time made by Ruck and Branka, but enchanted by Dagna, who had taken an obsessive interest in enchantments. I may have whispered in her ear that I could use magic. The armor was black as night and as intricate as you could want. In fact, they had smelted down my armor from 2 years ago and incorporated the metal into the new set. Trian had a cape commissioned with Educan symbol clasps. It was beautiful and apparently made from the toughest bronco hide he could find. He chuckled and said that it would make a fine Aramis cloak one day, but for now it was a fine cape. Mother had once again commissioned a garnet and gold gambeson cloak to wear beneath my armor, this time with silvered thread and jeweled studs in the padding corners. It sparkled with every movement, and I couldn't help but marvel at it. Father was surprisingly absent from the breakfast festivities. He'd never missed my birthday before. In fact, he would always make sure to have the entire day to spend taking me through the city, presenting me to the people, and doting on me as if I were Orzammar's greatest national treasure. His absence was peculiar, and I asked Mother about it. All Mother would say is that Father was dealing with something important, and that it would be something we would never forget. She seemed to get teary-eyed when she answered me, and that only served to increase my curiosity. Once again, I was escorted to the chamber of the assembly by Trian, Ogren, and Farin. But I was also escorted by the 100 Idukan warriors who would escort me to the surface. Apparently Father had insisted before he'd left for the assembly. The path to the assembly was packed with nobles, their retainers, and merchants who had received permission to set up stalls in the Diamond District. Today was a big day. I received shouts of "Happy birthday," "All hail Princess Idukan," "We're rooting for you, Princess," and the like. Today was a celebration and a day of hope for the entire city. I couldn't help but feel sorry for any Deshir who voted against the creation of the Surface Caste. When we reached the assembly, I was happy to see Rika waiting for us. I ran forward and gave her a hug. She was easily the best example of what our people could achieve if given the opportunity. She wished me luck and said she'd be cheering me on. We entered the assembly building with cheers at our backs. When the doors closed, Steward Brandelor was there to greet me. He offered me a bow. "Lady Idukan, first, allow me to wish you many happy returns on your birthday." I returned his bow with a curtsy of my own. "Thank you, Steward Brandelor. I hope I'm not late for the assembly." "My lady," the steward replied, "I'm afraid the assembly has already taken the matter to vote." "What?" I shouted in genuine panic. I stared up at the steward in disbelief. They couldn't have. It was my proposal, and I am allowed my time to speak on it. Why would they hold the vote without giving me my allotted time? Steward Brandelor smiled and bowed his head. "Forgive me, Lady Idukan, but they saw no need to hear you on the matter." "And why is that?" I asked with genuine anger. "I've worked for 2 years to prepare for this day. There are literally thousands of people outside hoping that I get to speak for them, their hopes, and their futures. What am I going to tell them when they find out the assembly voted without allowing me to speak? Princess, Brandalore said in a calm, soothing tone, you may tell them that there was no need for you to say anything. Over the past few months, the Dashirs have come to recognize the full benefits of the Surface Caste, as well as admiring your concerted effort and earnest strides in the matter. King Endrin called an early start to today's proceedings because he believed in the decision the Dashirs would come to. And, I asked with trepidation, I found that I'd taken a small, anxious step forward. What was the result of the vote? 80-0, the steward replied. All in favor. The Surface Caste is now officially a caste within Dwarven society. And it's all thanks to you, Princess. I nearly broke down on the spot. 2 years' worth of effort were a success, but I wasn't able to be there when it happened. I was certainly teary-eyed and doing my best to keep my composure. The Dashirs have decided to allow you to make the announcement, Princess, Brandalore added, as I let the relief sweep over me. I suppose I'll do that now then, I said, wiping my eyes. Actually, Princess, Brandalore said as he cleared his throat, there is another matter put before the Assembly that they're voting on today that they would like for you to be in attendance for. I looked up at the steward in veritable confusion. If this has anything to do with the Surface Caste, I brought all the financial numbers with me, along with... The steward chuckled and shook his head. No, Princess. While the matter came up because of the Surface Caste vote, it is something entirely separate. Would you honor the Assembly with your presence? I looked up to Trian, clearly confused. He smiled and nodded. Hear what they have to say, Merida. You've come all this way as it is. You may as well hear them out. I nodded and looked back at the steward. Very well. I'm happy to be of service to the Assembly. Excellent, Princess. Please, follow me. He motioned to the Assembly chamber doors, which were opened by the chamber guards. This time, all 100 of my guards filed in behind me. The center of the chamber was quite packed with us all. Steward Brandalore waited for everyone to settle in before addressing the Dashirs. Lords and ladies of the Assembly, today we have made history. Because of the efforts of Princess Merida Idukan, Orzammar is more prosperous and is seeing higher spirits since before the loss of Great Thygs. We expect that this prosperity will only continue to grow and grant us the chance at regaining ground we've lost to the Darkspawn menace. I believe the first way to show our appreciation is with a round of applause. There was a cry of "Hear, hear," before a round of applause echoed through the chamber that didn't settle down for a few minutes. When the applause finally relented, it was Father who stood to speak. My lords and ladies, Father began while smiling down at me, what our steward said is true. My daughter has brought about a time of excitement, prosperity, and positive change for our great city. Many Dashirs slapped the stone in front of them, stamped their feet, or banged the hilt of their weapons and staves on the floor in approval. It is extremely rare that a single dwarf contributes so much to our society, Father continued. Was he starting to tear up? His eyes were glassy. Indeed. The last 2 years of effort on her part will have a permanent effect on dwarves everywhere, and will be the reason we have hope for the future. More slapping, stomping, and banging in approval. It is with great joy, pride, and no small amount of fatherly regret. Father almost seemed to falter as he looked down at me. He was crying. That I ask you all to consider naming my daughter, Princess Merida Idukan. His voice cracked when he said our family name, a paragon. If my eyes could pop out of my head, they would have. I stared up at him in shock and disbelief. The moment between us seemed to last an eternity until the first "I" came from the side. I forced my gaze away from Father to see Branka standing and smiling. Another "I" from further up, this time from Denik Helmi. 2 more came from the top of the assembly, from Dashir representatives of House Bastel and House Harbon. Soon the chamber was ringing with approval to the motion. There wasn't a single dissenting vote. Steward Brandalore looked to Father and said, "The motion passes, Your Majesty, not a single nay." Father nodded and looked back at me, teary-eyed but proud. He looked up at the Dashirs. Lords and ladies of the Assembly, today history has been made twice. First, the creation of the new Surface Caste. And now, the individual who helped bring the Surface Caste into being has been named a paragon without a single dissenter. There is but one thing left to do, and that is to ask our new paragon, Lady Merida, what the name of her new house will be. Father met my eyes once again, and I subconsciously touched the Ducan caste clasps of my cloak. I looked up at Trian, and even his eyes were swelling up with tears. He had known even before we came here. I looked to Ogren and Farin, and the expressions they gave me told me that they had known as well. I was a paragon now, and I would no longer be thought of as an Ducan. I would be starting my own house, my own family. "Well, my lady?" Father asked with some sorrow in his tone. "The assembly awaits the name of the newest paragon. What shall we call you?" I stepped in and gave Father a hug. He knelt down and wrapped me in his arms. "I want to be an Ducan," I whispered to him, realizing that I truly meant what I said. "You will always be an Ducan," he whispered back, "and you will always be a part of our family. You are welcome home whenever you please, my girl." "But I still have to choose," I whispered, choking on the words. "You still have to choose," he whispered in reply, squeezing me tighter. I nodded into his shoulder and savored a few more moments in his embrace before stepping back. I looked around at the assembly, tears in my eyes, but with the conviction of the duty I had to perform in my expression. "I am Lady Merida Oro Doom, Paragon, and Princess of Orzammar." Everyone in attendance fell to one knee, Father included, and in unison shouted, "All hail Paragon Oro Doom." Oro Doom was a dwarven word, meaning obligation, fate, or something unavoidable. I thought of it as an obligation, though others might see it as fate or something that was unavoidable. "Father," Trian and the rest of the Dishirs stood up, and Father motioned behind me. "As a gift to you on this, the day of your naming and the day of your birth, Paragon Oro Doom, I present to you 100 of House Ducan's finest warriors, to keep you and your house safe from harm. These men and women have guarded you for the past 2 years and have each voluntarily offered their services ahead of time. They are now yours to command as you see fit." I turned to look at the warriors who were still kneeling. I had taken the time to at least learn their names, but it still seemed surprising that they would all wish to stay with me. I had to give a good impression, though. I understood, that much, at least. I squared back my shoulder and looked over the warriors. "Who among you will command my house guard?" "My paragon," Ogren said, still kneeling. "If it pleases you, I will command your guard until Farron is capable of doing so. Each warrior here has agreed that this would be best." "Ogren, of House Branca," I replied, trying to retain my air of professionalism. "You are already sworn to your wife's house. No doubt you have responsibilities there that would prevent you from overseeing my guard." "If I may speak, Paragon Orodum," Branca called from behind me. I turned and looked at her. In all respects, Branca was now my only peer in the room. We technically outranked my father. "Paragon? Branca? My husband has trained our guard well enough that he can take the time to assist your house with establishing itself," Branca said with a smile. "In fact, it was my suggestion. You are my student, and I consider you a dear friend. And in this, I cannot think of anyone better to protect you and yours until young Farron grows into the role. We've worked out the details already, and are happy to work with you if you agree." I couldn't help but smile at Branca. "If you insist, my friend, then I am happy to agree." "Then it would seem there's only one thing left to do," Father said. "What's that?" I asked as I looked up at him. "You have an announcement to make, and there are thousands of people outside waiting to hear the news." I sighed and nodded my head. It was all starting to really settle in now. There were 2 announcements to be made, but I was only making one of them. Who was going to make the other? I felt a hand on my shoulder and turned to find that Branca had come over. She smiled down at me. "Let's go tell them, shall we?" I nodded and turned, preparing to go when Trian stepped in front of me. He looked down at me before kneeling and bringing me in for a firm hug. "Thank you for everything, Trian," I said to him with genuine affection. "No, sister," he replied. "Thank you. You've shown me that there are other ways to work toward the benefit of our people and our family. You're an example to us all. I mean it. You've made your family proud. I am honored to call you my sister and my paragon." I smiled at him. This was the first time Trian had ever spoken to me in such a way. It was humbling. "Please make time to visit," I pleaded. He nodded firmly. As often as I can. Now go. Do your family and your new house proud." I nodded and released my hold on him. I gave him and father one last smile, then started toward the chamber doors. Branka kept pace with me while Ogre and Farin fell in behind us, and the new warriors of House Orodum stood and fell into formation behind them. "Paragon Orodum!" Trian called after us. I turned to look back at him, wondering what he was going to say. He smiled confidently and shot me a knowing look. "You should tell them now. Show them all what you can really do." It took me a moment to think of what he meant, but when it finally clicked, I couldn't help but grin at him. I nodded and moved to exit the building accompanied by my new house. Branka and I stopped at the steps leading up to the assembly building, flanked by Ogren and Farin. The crowd was dead silent. All eyes were on me. A sea of dwarves were waiting with bated breath to hear the results of the only vote they were aware of. I looked out over the crowd and found Rika nearby, just as hopeful, nervous, and expectant as all the others. "People of Orzammar," I called out so that my voice could carry over the massive crowd. "For the past 2 years, I have worked tirelessly for each and every one of you. My every waking moment has been dedicated to seeing each of you benefit in some way with the creation of the Surface Caste. Whether it's to bring you more materials with your craft, to elevate your position within our society, or to put more coins in your coffers, I have tried my very best to see that the whole of Dwarven society benefits from a historic change to our caste system." I scanned the crowd and let the words hang over them for just a moment before continuing. "I genuinely hope for the best for each and every one of you, and because of that, because of the love I have for each and every one of Orzammar's citizens, I have spent a good portion of my young life dedicated to making this happen for all of you." I paused again. I wanted this to be a moment they would never forget, so building the anticipation was key. You could almost see them trembling to hear the results at this point. Some eyes were even tearing up after I said how much I cared about them. It was mostly showmanship, but not totally untrue. I did want what was best for everyone, and I did care for them as a noble and one of their potential future rulers. So it is with a full and happy heart, then I am pleased to announce— One more pause, but I could see the ripple of excitement rolling through the crowd with the positive preface that the vote to establish the Surface Caste has passed with a unanimous vote of 80-1. I cheered the last part, but my cheer was almost immediately drowned out by the crowd. The crowd surged up and forward, roaring in excitement and celebration. Individual dwarves became a single, roiling mass of joy. As a teenager, I'd gone to a college football game once in my past life. The excitement of the game with each touchdown hurt my ears back then. That is the only thing I have in my experience that could possibly compare to the roar I was hearing now, and every single bit of it was directed at me. It took a few minutes for the crowd to calm down, and even when it did, there were still cries of hope and support. It took Branka to hold up her hands and wait a full 2 minutes to recapture the attention of the masses. "There is one more announcement to be made," Branka began before I could start. She looked down at me with a grin. I looked up at her and nodded. The news would come best from another paragon. For her efforts in this historic moment in our history, and the effect her work will have on all dwarves in Orzammar from now and into perpetuity, the Assembly has declared the Lady Merida I Dukan. Now she paused for dramatic effect. "Shall be known henceforth as Paragon Merida Oro Doom." If the first roar from the crowd had hurt my ears, this second reaction nearly made me deaf. I admit the joy of the crowd forced a wide smile on my face. I raised a hand to acknowledge their cheers, but chants of "All hail Paragon Oro Doom" and "Long live Paragon Oro Doom" went on for some time. I started holding up my hands to try and regain the crowd's attention. Branka had to help, and it still took us a few minutes for the crowd to regain its composure. They had learned about the new Surface Caste, that there was a new living paragon among them. What else could they possibly expect to hear? "There is one more thing I must tell you all, something just as monumental and unique as the declaration of the Surface Caste," I started, nervous and excited to finally reveal my true nature to them. I stepped forward, the tips of my toes just at the edge of the top step to the building. For the first time in Dwarven history, a dwarf has been born with the power to wield magic, and I, Paragon Merida Oro Doom, am that dwarf. Witness now the power of dwarven sorcery. I raised my hand above my head and summoned freezing winds and snow, creating a blizzard over the entire crowd. Not a single dwarf moved or cheered. Every one of them were frozen, not from the cold, but in sheer awe of what they were seeing. I let the blizzard rage and swirl for a minute before releasing the magic and allowing the air to settle down once more. Every dwarf stared at me in amazement. From the lowest merchant to Branka, Farin, and Ogren, and all 100 of my new house guard. Then it happened. A roar of excitement so loud I had to turn my head and brace myself to endure the sheer force of the magnitude made the sound genuinely painful. I used some of my mana to enhance the volume of my voice to shout over the cheering crowd. I am Princess Merida Oro Doom. I am your paragon, and my house will be looking for those of you with the most potential and strongest will. We will not sit on our laurels and be content with the contributions of the past. Our eyes turn to the deep roads and to retaking the lost thags of our people. Who's with me? The shape rate will tell you that the response to my speech shook the very foundations of Orzammar. You will never hear me argue otherwise.